If you're building a business right now, your weeks might look something like this. You start early, you work all day, you answer emails at night, and squeeze in a little more work on the weekend when no one looks. And somehow it still feels like you're behind. At some point, a question starts kind of creeping into your head. If I'm working 60 or 70 hours a week, is that what entrepreneurship requires, or is something in the business actually broken? Because the advice you usually hear sounds something like this. It's that's the grind, that's the hustle, that's what it takes to start a business. And well, sometimes that's true. But sometimes those long hours are telling you something else, something important. So in this episode, I'm not going to give you a simple yes or no answer. Instead, I want to give you a few ways to figure out what those long hours actually mean inside your business. Because sometimes it's normal, sometimes they're temporary, and sometimes it's a warning sign. And understanding the difference between those situations can completely change how you think about your business. Hi, I'm Matt. I've spent over 25 years building companies as a serial entrepreneur and helping small business owners navigate the realities of starting and growing businesses. On this channel, we talk about the real world side of entrepreneurship, the parts that usually happen beyond the blood, sweat, and tears. But before we get into the different scenarios, I'm kind of curious about something. If you're currently starting or running a business, how many hours a week are you realistically working on it right now? 30, 40, 70? 90? Drop it down in the comments. I'd be really interested to see what the range looks like. Entrepreneurship is often romanticized as constant hustle, working nonstop, sleeping 4 hours a night on the office floor, grinding harder than everyone else. And if you're working 60 hours a week or more, it can feel like that's just kind of the price of building a business. But here's the important thing. Hours worked is not the same as progress made. Let that sink in. In reality, there are usually three very different reasons someone might be working long hours in a business. The first is probably pretty simple. It's what you thought of. You're building something. Early stage businesses require a lot of effort. You're learning new skills, you're wearing multiple hats, you're solving problems that just haven't been solved yet. All that's normal. The second reason is also pretty common. The business simply just can't afford extra help yet. You might know you need an employee or a sub, but the revenue isn't there to support it yet. So the only option is for the owner to carry more of the workload. And this happens a lot in small businesses. But there's also a third possibility. Sometimes the long hours are happening because something about the structure of the business just isn't working well. And those three situations lead to three very different decisions. So the real goal of this episode isn't to tell you whether working 60 hours a week is good or bad. The goal is to help you figure out which situation you're actually in so you can plan accordingly. So let's start with the most common one. There are definitely phases of entrepreneurship where long hours are expected, especially in the early stages. When you're starting a business, everything is new. You're building out systems and figuring out the market. You're learning how to sell and how to operate. In those early months or years, the owner is usually the engine that just keeps everything moving. There are also temporary phases where the workload kind of spikes. If you're launching something new, hiring staff, fixing a major operational problem. And in those cases, the long hours aren't necessarily a problem. They're just kind of part of building momentum. But there's one important difference between healthy long hours and unhealthy long hours. Healthy long hours usually produce some kind of leverage over time, better systems, higher revenue, staff support, processes that make the next year easier than the last. And if the long hours never lead to that, well, then it's worth taking a closer look, because not every 60-hour week falls into that category. Sometimes these long hours are actually a warning sign. This is the part where some entrepreneurs start to get a little uncomfortable, because working hard isn't the problem. Most entrepreneurs are willing to do that. But if someone is consistently working 60 hours a week for years, it can sometimes signal structural problems inside the business. The business model might require too much labor for the revenue it generates. You have low margins, you have high effort per customer. Every dollar requires a lot of time and a lot of money. Another possibility is that the owner has kind of become the bottleneck. Every decision runs through them, so nothing moves without their involvement. In other cases, the business simply hasn't developed the right systems yet. The same problems show up over and over again because nothing's really getting fixed permanently. And sometimes the reality is uncomfortable. If the business collapses the moment you as the owner slow down, maybe you don't own a business yet. You just own a job with extra stress attached to it. But there's also another possibility that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Sometimes the long hours aren't caused by the business at all. Sometimes they're caused by a psychological hurdle the owner just hasn't worked through yet. Some entrepreneurs struggle to delegate even when they could afford help. Others hesitate to raise prices because they're afraid their customers are going to leave. Some people stay buried in the operational work long after the business needs them to move into more of a leadership role, because staying busy can feel safer than stepping into that new role. And in those cases, the business might actually be ready to kind of move on to another stage, but the owner just hasn't fully embraced that transition yet. And that can quietly keep someone trapped in 60-hour work weeks for years. Let me show you what this looks like in the real world. I've seen business owners working 60 and 70 or more, 80 hours a week, running service companies. They were exhausted, and they assumed that's just what owning a business required. But when they really looked at the numbers, something became clear. They weren't underpricing their work. They weren't lacking in demand. The real problem was that they were still trying to do everything themselves. Sales, operations, customer-facing work, scheduling. Once they hired the right help and maybe built a few simple systems, that workload changed dramatically. The business didn't get smaller. In fact, it actually got healthier, but the structure had to evolve. And that leads to an important question. If you're wondering whether your workload is normal or a warning sign, here's what I usually ask. If you stopped working tomorrow, what would happen to the business? Would it just kind of slow down temporarily, or continue operating with staff and systems, or just completely stop functioning? Because most early stage businesses start in that third category. They completely stop functioning. But over time, the goal should be moving towards the second one, where the business can operate, at least temporarily, without the owner being involved in every single detail. Because the real measure of progress isn't how many hours you work. It's how dependent the business is on you to operate. And once you understand that, an even better question starts to emerge. Instead of asking, is 60 hours too much? The better question is, what would have to change for this business to operate with me working 30 or 40 hours instead of 60 or 70? That question forces you to look at things like your pricing and your staffing and your systems, your processes, even your entire business model. Sometimes the answer is pretty simple. Sometimes it might be a little uncomfortable, but it's almost always revealing. And this is something almost every entrepreneur wrestles with at some point. So you're not alone. Working hard isn't the problem. Most entrepreneurs are willing to do that. While some businesses require long hours when you're building them and starting them up, no business should require long hours forever just to survive. And if you're currently working 60 or 70 or more hours a week, it might be worth asking whether you're building the business you intended to build, or did you just create a stressful job? Because the goal isn't just to work hard. It's to build something that eventually works for you too. If you're running a business right now, I'd love to know, what part of your business consumes the most hours each week? Is it sales or operations? Maybe it's customer-facing work or admin. Let me know down in the comments. I read and I respond to all of them, and they actually shape where the future episodes come from, so I can answer your questions directly. All right. Take a breath. You got this. Now, what's next?